There is a story the ancient world never stopped telling. It traveled first as breath, passed from one mouth to the next around fires that burned along the Aegean coast, long before anyone thought to write a single word of it down. Poets carried it. Sailors murmured it. Mothers whispered pieces of it to children who would one day grow up and whisper those same pieces to their own. And somewhere in that long, unbroken chain of human voices, it became something that no individual person could claim to have invented, because it had always simply been. It had always been there, the way the sea itself had always been there, ancient, patient, and utterly indifferent to the passage of time. We call it the Odyssey, and we have been calling it that for nearly 3,000 years. At its surface, the story is simple enough. A man is trying to go home. A war has ended, the great, terrible siege of Troy, and the warriors who survived it are slowly making their way back across the water to the lives they left behind. Most of them arrive. Some of them don't. But one man's journey home becomes something altogether different. Something longer, something stranger, something that will take 10 full years and carry him to the edges of the known world and beyond. That man is Odysseus, king of Ithaca, husband of Penelope, father of Telemachus, and, depending on which god you had managed to anger that particular morning, either the cleverest man alive or the most cursed. He is not the strongest hero of the ancient Greek tradition. That would be Achilles, who burns like a star through the Iliad, brilliant, furious, and brief. Odysseus is something else entirely. He is the one who thinks, the one who speaks carefully when others speak rashly, the one who builds a wooden horse when a sword will no longer do. He is the hero not of brute force, but of endurance, of surviving, adapting, and finding a way forward when every road appears to be closed. And it is that quality, perhaps more than any other, that has kept his story alive all this time. We attribute the Odyssey to a poet named Homer, whether Homer was a single man, a woman, a blind wandering singer of the Ionian coast, or simply a convenient name we gave to a long tradition of oral poetry. Scholars have been arguing about this for centuries, and they will likely be arguing about it for centuries more. What we can say with some confidence is that the poem was composed somewhere around the 8th century before the Common Era, and that by the time it was written down, it had already been sung aloud for generations. It contains 24 books, nearly 12,000 lines of verse, and within those lines, it manages to contain something that feels almost impossible for a text of its age: genuine, recognizable human emotion. A father who doesn't know if his son is still alive. A wife who refuses to give up hope, though every reasonable voice around her tells her she should. A man on a distant shore, sitting at the edge of the ocean at sunset, weeping quietly for a home he isn't sure he'll ever see again. These are not the feelings of myth. These are the feelings of people. That is why this story endures. Not because of the monsters, though the monsters are extraordinary. Not because of the gods, though the gods are fascinating and strange and sometimes genuinely terrifying. It endures because underneath every adventure, every enchantment, every impossible trial, there is something beating at its very center that any human being across any age can immediately recognize. The desire to return to the place you belong, the fear that you no longer will. Over the course of this documentary, we will follow Odysseus from the smoldering ruins of Troy all the way back to the rocky shores of Ithaca. We will meet the figures who stand in his way and the ones who help him along it. We will sit with the poem's silences, its grief, its wonder, its occasional, unexpected tenderness, and we will try to understand why this particular journey, told by these particular voices so very long ago, has never once stopped feeling as though it were told about us. The sea is waiting, and so is he. Let us begin. Part 1. The weight of what we've done. Troy burned for days. That is not a poet's exaggeration. It is simply what happened when a city the size of Troy, walled, wealthy, stacked with timber and textiles, and the dry goods of a decade's hoarding, was finally put to the torch. The smoke would have been visible from the islands. Sailors far out at sea would have looked toward the eastern horizon and seen that great dark column rising against the sky, and they would have known, without needing to be told, that something enormous had just ended. 10 years. That is how long the Greeks had camped on the windy plain outside those walls. 10 years of dying in the mud, 10 years of plague, of quarrel, of watching their best men fall. Patroclus, Achilles, Ajax, 10 years of a war that sometimes seemed as though it would simply go on forever, grinding both sides slowly to nothing, until the walls of Troy and the Greek ships on the beach were all that was left of either civilization. And then, in the space of a single night, it was over. The wooden horse, the soldiers inside it, pressed together in the dark, barely breathing. The gates opened from within, the fires lit, the screaming in the streets. It is one of history's most famous acts of cunning, and it belonged, as most of the war's great acts of cunning did, to Odysseus. But victory, as the Greeks were about to discover, carries its own kind of cost. There is a concept the ancient Greeks understood very well, and it surfaces constantly in their literature, their philosophy, and their mythology alike. They called it hubris. We translate it today as arrogance or pride. But those words don't quite carry the full weight of the original. Hubris was something more specific. It was the particular transgression of a mortal who had forgotten, even briefly, the proper distance between themselves and the gods, who had looked at what they had accomplished and felt, for just a moment, that perhaps they owed nothing to anyone. The Greeks who sacked Troy committed hubris on a grand scale. The temples were desecrated. Sacred spaces were violated. A woman named Cassandra, princess of Troy, priestess of Apollo, was dragged from the altar, where she had taken refuge, and assaulted in full view of the gods. Ajax the Lesser, a Greek captain, did this, and Apollo, who had watched the whole affair, was not the forgiving kind. When the Greek fleet finally pushed off from the burning shores of Troy and turned their prows westward toward home, they were not sailing under the banner of divine favor. They were sailing under the quiet, cold attention of gods who felt they were owed a reckoning. For some men, that reckoning came quickly. Storms swallowed entire fleets. Ships were smashed against rocks. Warriors who had survived 10 years of warfare drowned within sight of their own islands. The homecomings of the Greek heroes are, almost without exception, either tragic or deeply strange, and the mythology makes clear that this was not accident. It was consequence. Odysseus' journey would be the longest consequence of all. He left Troy with 12 ships, each crewed by men from Ithaca, men who had crossed the Aegean with him a decade ago as young soldiers and were now attempting the same crossing as something harder to name. Veterans, survivors, men who had seen things they would spend the rest of their lives trying to make sense of. The initial plan, as far as there was a plan, was to sail southwest across the Aegean and pick up the winds that would carry them home. Ithaca was not far, not in geographic terms. A competent sailor with steady winds could make the crossing in a matter of weeks. There was, at this early stage, no particular reason to believe that the journey home would be anything other than straightforward. The gods, of course, had other ideas. The fleet's first landfall was a place called Ismarus. It sat on the Thracian coast, the northern shore of the Aegean, and it was home to a people called the Cicones. Now, the Cicones had been allies of Troy during the war. Technically, this made them enemies of Odysseus and his men, and so in the aftermath of their great victory, still flushed with the heat of conquest, the Greeks did what Greeks of the heroic age tended to do when they encountered an enemy settlement. They raided it. They sacked the town, divided the spoils, and made camp on the beach. And here is where the story delivers its first quiet lesson, one that is easy to overlook, tucked as it is near the very beginning, before any of the famous monsters or enchantresses have made their appearance. Odysseus himself tells us later that he ordered his men to take what they had won and return immediately to the ships. He could see what they could not. He understood that time spent celebrating on an enemy coast was time given to the enemy's neighbors to gather their forces. His men did not listen. They stayed on the beach through the night, feasting and drinking, because they had just won the greatest war in living memory, and they were not yet ready to simply sail away as though it hadn't happened. By morning, the Cicones had sent word inland. Reinforcements arrived, infantry and cavalry, and in the battle that followed, Odysseus lost 72 men. 6 from every ship, 72 men, and they hadn't even left the eastern Aegean yet. He says he wept for them. He says this plainly, without embarrassment or qualification, the way a commander speaks of men he has actually lost. And there is something important in that. In the fact that our hero's journey begins not with triumph, but with grief. With the weight of men who died because he gave an order and no one followed it. The Odyssey has been telling us something since its very first act of violence. Survival is not the same as wisdom, and wisdom, when it is present, is not always enough. The fleet fled south before a growing storm rounded the headland and was then struck by winds of a violence that the poem describes with a kind of terrible precision. Zeus himself, or so the text implies, had sent this weather. The ships were driven off course. The sails were split. For 2 days and 2 nights the Greeks lay at the bottom of their hulls, doing nothing but holding on, while the sea did whatever it wished with them. When the storm finally broke, they found themselves somewhere off the North African coast. Exactly where is a matter of some scholarly debate, and perhaps the geography was never the point. What mattered was that they had been carried far, far south of any route that would take them home. They were already in waters none of them recognized. They rowed along the coastline until they found a bay they could anchor in safely, and there, for 3 days, they rested. They dragged out the bodies of the men who had died at Ismarus and buried them on the shore. They cooked, they slept. The poem gives us these 3 quiet days without apology, understanding that the men needed them, and understanding, perhaps, that we need them too. Grief is not something you sail through. Sometimes you have to stop. On the 4th day, they put out to sea again. And shortly after, they came to the land of the Lotus Eaters. Who the Lotus Eaters were exactly is something that has puzzled commentators since antiquity. The poem is deliberately vague about them. They are not presented as dangerous in any conventional sense. They don't attack, they don't threaten, they don't demand tribute or worship. They are simply a people who subsist on a particular flower, a lotus, the eating of which produces in anyone who tastes it an immediate and total dissolution of desire. Not euphoria exactly, not happiness in any active sense, simply the complete and painless absence of any wish to be anywhere other than exactly where you are. Odysseus sends 3 men ashore to scout. They meet the Lotus Eaters, who offer them the flower with what appears to be genuine, uncomplicated hospitality. The men eat, and that is that. All thought of home vanishes, all memory of Ithaca, of wives and children and aging parents, of the life that is waiting for them, gone. Not destroyed exactly, just rendered entirely irrelevant by the soft, encompassing contentment of the lotus. Odysseus has to drag them back to the ships by force. He ties them weeping under the rowing benches and orders the rest of the fleet to put out immediately, before anyone else goes ashore and tastes what those 3 men tasted. It is a brief episode, barely a page in most translations. And yet it has haunted readers for millennia. perhaps because it presents a danger that has nothing to do with claws or malice or divine wrath. The Lotus Eaters are not trying to destroy Odysseus's men. They are simply offering them the one thing that, in some very dark and honest corner of the heart, a man who has spent 10 years at war might most desperately want: to forget, to stop wanting, to simply rest. The fact that Odysseus resists this, that he refuses it for himself and refuses to allow his men to succumb to it, tells us something essential about who he is. He is not a man who wants to stop. He wants to arrive. And there is a difference between those two things that the Odyssey will keep returning to in different forms again and again. They rode through the night. And in the grey early light of the following morning, they came within sight of an island, green, well-watered, drifting with the bleating of goats. Wild goats, the poem tells us, in extraordinary numbers, undisturbed by any human presence. There were meadows near the shore, fresh water, timber for the ships. The men made camp, slaughtered goats for the feast, drew wine from the ships, and fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. But it was what they could see from that island, across a narrow channel of dark water, that would define everything that came next. Another shore, higher ground, darker, and, from somewhere in the hills above it, voices, or not quite voices, sounds, deep, rolling, formless sounds, that weren't the wind and weren't the sea and weren't anything the men could name with any confidence. Odysseus decided in the morning that he wanted to take a closer look. The Cyclops Polyphemus. We should take a moment here to sit with what this creature actually represents. Before the cave, before the fire, before the stake driven into the enormous eye. Because the Cyclops in the Odyssey is not simply a monster placed in the story to give our hero something to fight. He is something considerably more interesting than that. Polyphemus is the son of Poseidon, god of the sea. This detail is not incidental. It is the hinge upon which the entire rest of the story turns. But it is equally important to understand what kind of being he is before Odysseus ever enters his cave. The Cyclopes, as Homer describes them, are a people outside of civilization entirely. They have no laws, no assemblies, no ships. They do not farm, because the earth gives them what they need without cultivation. They live alone, each in his own cave, on his own hill, caring nothing for his neighbors, and less for any stranger who might wash up on his coast. They are, in other words, the complete inversion of the Greek ideal, where Greek civilization prized hospitality, community, law, and the sea as a connector of peoples. The Cyclopes represent isolation, lawlessness, self-sufficiency so absolute it has curdled into contempt for anyone beyond the self. When Odysseus rows ashore with 12 of his best men, he brings a goatskin of extraordinarily powerful wine, a gift from a priest of Apollo, so potent that it must be diluted 20 parts water to 1 part wine before it becomes drinkable. He brings it, he tells us, because something in his heart told him he might need it. Something told him that whatever waited in those hills might require the kind of persuasion that courtesy alone could not provide. They find the cave unoccupied. It is immense. Enormous wooden pans holding lambs and kids, racks of drying cheese, pails of whey. The men want to take what they can carry and leave before the owner returns. This is the sensible option. This is clearly the correct option. Odysseus refuses. He wants to see, he tells us, what the owner of a cave like this might offer by way of gifts to a guest. It is, arguably, the single worst decision of his entire journey. Polyphemus returns at dusk, driving his flocks before him. He rolls a stone across the mouth of the cave, a stone so large that 20 wagons could not have shifted it. He builds his fire, he milks his ewes, and then the firelight falls across the far corner of the cave. and he sees the men. What follows is a scene of extraordinary psychological tension. Because Odysseus's only weapon here is language, he has no military option. There is no way to fight a creature the size of a small hill. There is no way to move the stone. There is only words, and the particular quality of mind that knows how to arrange them. He invokes the laws of hospitality. Xenia, one of the most sacred obligations in the Greek world. He asks Polyphemus to remember that Zeus protects all guests and all suppliants, and that to harm a stranger under one's roof is to invite the god's wrath. Polyphemus laughs. The Cyclopes, he informs Odysseus, care nothing for Zeus. They are stronger than the gods. Zeus can do whatever he likes. Then he reaches into the darkness, picks up 2 of the men, dashes them against the ground, and eats them. There is no softening this in the translation. Homer does not look away. The men are eaten. Odysseus watches and can do nothing, because if he kills the Cyclops now, they will all die sealed inside that cave with a stone no amount of human strength can move. So he watches, and he waits, and that mind of his, that restless, calculating, extraordinary mind, begins to move. The next morning, after Polyphemus has sealed his flocks inside for the day and rolled the stone back into place, Odysseus finds a great wooden staff drying in the cave, the trunk of an olive tree, roughly the size of a ship's mast. He has his men sharpen one end to a point and harden it in the embers of the fire. That night, when the Cyclops returns, Odysseus offers him a bowl of the wine. Polyphemus drinks it. He has never tasted wine before, only milk and water, and the effect is immediate and overwhelming. He holds out his bowl and asks for more, and promises Odysseus a guest gift in return. Odysseus pours again. The Cyclops asks his name, and here Odysseus does something that is either deeply clever or profoundly revealing, depending on how you read it. He says his name is Nobody. Polyphemus, drunk and delighted, tells Nobody that his guest gift will be that he eats nobody last. Then he falls unconscious. Odysseus and his men drive the sharpened stake into the fire until it glows, and then they drive it, all of them together with their full weight, into the sleeping eye of Polyphemus. The Cyclops screams. The other Cyclopes come running to the mouth of the cave, asking what is the matter, who is hurting him. Nobody, he screams back. Nobody is hurting me. And the others, unable to make sense of this, go back to their own caves and their own sleep. In the morning, Polyphemus rolls away the stone to let his flocks out for the day, crouching in the entrance and feeling with his hands for any man trying to slip past. Odysseus ties his men underneath the bellies of the great rams, clinging to the wall. The animals file out. The blind Cyclops runs his hands over their backs, checking for stowaways, feeling nothing. The last ram is the biggest, and as it passes, Polyphemus pauses and speaks to it. Gently, the great monster who had eaten men 2 at a time speaks to his favorite ram, with something that sounds almost like tenderness, wondering why it is the last out this morning, whether it is grieving for its master's eye. It is one of the most quietly devastating moments in the entire poem, because it reminds us, deliberately, carefully, that Polyphemus is not simply a monster. He is something that had a life before Odysseus came, and will have a diminished one after he leaves. Once they are clear of the cave, Odysseus frees his men, and they drive the animals down to the ships. The other crews, who had watched and waited all night, weep with relief when they see them coming, and then Odysseus does something he should not do. As the ships pull away from the shore, he cups his hands and shouts back toward the island. He mocks the Cyclops. He tells him, at length and with considerable satisfaction, that he has received the punishment he deserved. His men beg him to stop. They are pleading with him. The Cyclops is hurling cliff faces at the sound of the voice, and they are nearly being swamped by the waves the impacts generate. But Odysseus keeps going, and at the last, when the ships are almost out of range, he shouts something that changes the entire course of everything that follows. He shouts his real name. I am Odysseus, son of Laertes of Ithaca. If anyone asks who blinded you, tell them it was me. He cannot help it. He is a man who needs to be known, who needs credit for what he has done. It is, in its way, the same impulse that built the wooden horse, the same hunger for recognition that makes him extraordinary, and the same hunger that will cost him everything. Polyphemus, blind on his beach, lifts his hands to his father Poseidon and prays. He asks the god of the sea to ensure that Odysseus of Ithaca never reaches home, or if fate has already decreed that he must, let it be late, let it be alone, let him arrive on a strange ship to find only sorrow waiting. Poseidon heard, and the sea from that moment forward was never again a road. It was an opponent. Part 2. The world keeps getting stranger. There are journeys that break a man by degrees, not in a single catastrophic moment. Not the way a ship breaks on a reef, all at once, with a sound like the world splitting, but slowly, quietly, the way water works its way into stone. One loss at a time, one wrong turn compounding the last. One morning, waking up on a shore that looks nothing like home, with fewer men than there were yesterday, and the horizon offering nothing but more horizon. This is where Odysseus finds himself as part 2 of his journey begins. He has 12 ships, had 12 ships, 2 encounters in, and the losses are already beginning to accumulate in the way that losses do when a man's luck has truly, fundamentally turned against him. The dead of Ismarus, the weeping men dragged from the lotus fields, and now pulling away from the Cyclops' island, with the sound of cliff faces hitting the water still ringing in their ears. The crew of 11 remaining ships rose in ragged, exhausted silence. There is no celebration. There is wine. There are the Cyclops' own rams to slaughter and eat. But the feast is subdued in the way that all meals are subdued when eaten by people who have just narrowly escaped being eaten themselves. And Odysseus, at the stern of his ship, watches the smoke still rising from the Cyclops' hillside, and understands something clearly, perhaps for the first time. He has made an enemy of the sea, not metaphorically, not poetically, literally. The god who rules every wave between here and Ithaca has heard his son's prayer and has answered it. Getting home, which was always going to be difficult, has just become something considerably harder to name. The fleet came next to the floating island of Aeolus. This detail, the island that floats, is one of those touches in the Odyssey that feels dreamlike, and is perhaps meant to. We are moving by this point away from the recognizable geography of the Aegean coast and into something more unmapped, more interior. The places Odysseus visits from here on exist in a space that is partly the Mediterranean and partly the human imagination, and it is not always easy or necessary to draw the boundary between them. Aeolus was the keeper of the winds, not a god exactly, but something appointed by the gods, a mortal king elevated to custodianship of one of the world's most essential forces. He lived on his floating island with his wife and his 12 children, 6 sons and 6 daughters, all married to one another in the sealed, self-contained manner of a family that has no interest in the wider world. They feasted constantly. They were, by all accounts, extremely pleasant hosts. Odysseus spent an entire month with Aeolus, a month of feasting, of telling his story, and he was a magnificent storyteller, which helped, of resting, of allowing his men to eat well and sleep deeply and slowly, become something resembling functional again. Aeolus listened to the story of Troy, of the Cyclops, of everything that had happened, and he was generous in his admiration and generous in his assistance. When it came time to leave, he gave Odysseus a gift of extraordinary practical value. He gathered all the winds of the world, all the contrary winds, all the storm bringers, all the gales that could push a ship sideways or backward or down, and he bound them inside a leather bag, a great ox hide, sealed with a silver cord. He placed this bag in the hold of Odysseus's ship himself and told him to guard it carefully. And then he sent the west wind, the one wind that would carry the fleet straight to Ithaca, blowing gently and steadily at their backs. For 9 days and 9 nights they sailed, 9 days of good wind and open water. And Ithaca appeared on the 10th day. The men could see it, fires on the shore, the particular shape of the hills they had grown up looking at. They were so close that they could see men moving on the beach. Odysseus at the helm had not slept in 9 days. He had not let himself sleep. But he was only human, and the sight of home, the tremendous dropping relief of it, finally pulled him under. He closed his eyes for just a moment, and the men, who had been watching that sealed bag in the hold with growing curiosity for 9 days, made their move. They had convinced each other somehow, in the whispered reasoning of exhausted and resentful people, that Aeolus must have given Odysseus a bag of treasure, gold from his famous wealth, a private gift, kept secret from the rest of them. They untied the silver cord. Every wind in the world came out at once. The storm that followed drove the fleet all the way back to the floating island of Aeolus in a matter of hours. Every mile of those 9 days undone. Ithaca, the fires, the familiar hills, the men on the beach, gone again behind a wall of screaming weather. When they limped back to the harbor and Odysseus went to Aeolus and explained what had happened, the keeper of the winds regarded him for a long moment with an expression that had shifted from warmth to something much cooler. He refused to help again. A man so comprehensively abandoned by the gods, he said, was not a man he could assist. To do so would be to set himself against forces larger than hospitality required. He sent Odysseus away. There is a particular quality to this failure, to arriving within sight of home and having it taken away by the greed and suspicion of the very men you are trying to bring home. That sits differently from all the other disasters in the poem. The monsters and the storms are external. They come from outside. But this one was from inside. This one was human nature, which is sometimes its own kind of tempest. They rowed away from Aeolus with no wind at all. 6 days and 6 nights of pure, grinding labor. Men bent double over oars on a sea gone flat and indifferent until they reached another harbor. High cliffs on either side, a narrow entrance, water that barely moved. This was the land of the Laestrygonians. The Laestrygonians are not as famous as the Cyclops, but in terms of sheer catastrophe, they represent the single worst moment of Odysseus's journey. 11 ships sailed into that harbor. 1 sailed out. The Laestrygonians were giants, like the Cyclops in scale, but unlike the Cyclops in number, where Polyphemus was a solitary monster on a lonely hillside. The Laestrygonians were a society of monsters, numerous and organized and utterly without the particular scruple that prevents civilized peoples from treating guests as food. They lined the cliff tops and threw boulders down onto the ships trapped in the harbor below. They speared men in the water like fish and carried them away. Odysseus alone had anchored his ship outside the harbor entrance, a detail the poem gives us without much commentary, but which speaks volumes about the quality of his instincts. Something about that narrow inlet, those high cliffs, the too still water had made him uneasy, and so while 11 ships were destroyed, systematically, efficiently, from above, Odysseus's crew cut their anchor cable with a sword, seized the oars, and rowed with everything they had for open water. They made it. 1 ship, 1 crew. The rest, the men, the vessels, all of it, gone. The poem tells us they rowed away weeping, glad to be alive and grieving the dead simultaneously, which is one of those combinations of feelings that has no single word for it in any language. They simply rowed, because rowing was something to do, and doing something was better than sitting with the full weight of what had just happened. They came to an island called Aia. They anchored in a sheltered bay, and for 2 days and 2 nights they did not move. They lay on the beach in the condition that falls over men after the kind of losses they had just sustained. A stillness that is not quite grief and not quite shock, but something compounded of both. On the 3rd day, Odysseus climbed to a high point on the island and surveyed the interior. He saw smoke rising from somewhere deep in the trees. A hearth, a dwelling, a sign of some kind of habitation. He went back to the men. He divided them into 2 groups, and they drew lots to see who would go inland and investigate. The lot fell to a man named Eurylochus, who took 22 men into the forest while Odysseus waited on the beach. They found a stone house in a clearing, surrounded by wolves and lions, but wolves and lions that behaved strangely, that wagged their tails like dogs, that pressed their great heads against the men's hands and made sounds of welcome. The men, understandably unsettled, paused at the edge of the clearing, and then they heard a voice from inside the house, a beautiful voice, singing, accompanied by a loom. All but Eurylochus went in. The woman at the loom was named Circe. She was, the poem tells us, the daughter of the sun god Helios and a daughter of ocean. She was, by any measure, a figure of considerable divine inheritance. She was also a witch, or something close to it, a practitioner of deep pharmaca, the ancient world's word for a compound of medicine and magic that we have never quite managed to separate cleanly into modern categories. She offered the men a feast, wine, barley, honey, cheese, and mixed into it something that made them forget their homes. Then she touched each man with a wand, and the men of Odysseus's crew became pigs, not metaphorically, pigs, in body and in snout and bristle and grunt, though the poem is careful to note that their minds remained their own. They knew what had happened to them. They knew what they were. This is the detail that makes it something other than simply a transformation. The men looked out through pigs' eyes at a world gone strange and low and rooting, with their own human understanding entirely intact. That is not a comfortable thing to imagine. Eurylochus had watched from the tree line. He ran back to the beach and told Odysseus what he had seen, though he wept so hard in the telling that it took him some time to get the words out. Odysseus went alone into the forest. On the path to Circe's house, he was met by a young man who introduced himself as Hermes, messenger of the gods, and who expressed the particular wry concern of a divine being who has seen this situation before and knows exactly how badly it tends to end. He told Odysseus what he was walking toward. He told him what Circe would do, and then he gave him something to prevent it, a plant, white-flowered and dark-rooted, called moly, which no mortal could dig from the earth without divine assistance, but which, eaten, would make Odysseus immune to Circe's transforming drafts. And then Hermes told him what to do when Circe's wand failed to work on him. He told him to rush at her with his sword drawn, as though he meant to kill her. And then, when she flinched and asked what he was, to make her swear by the gods that she would play no further tricks on him. Odysseus did precisely this. He took the moly. He walked into the house. He ate the feast she offered him, felt nothing, and when she raised her wand and said the words, he drew his sword and moved. The transformation this produces in Circe is immediate and total. She falls to her knees. She calls him by his name. She has been expecting him, she says. Word had come from Hermes that a man called Odysseus would one day come to this island, and she had always wondered when. She asks him to sheathe the sword. He asks her to restore his men. She does, anointing each pig with a second ointment that reverses the first. The men come back to themselves, younger looking, the poem says, and taller and fairer than they had been before. And they weep. and Circe, watching them weep, is moved by something that looks very much like ordinary human feeling. She is not simply a villain recovered. She is something more complicated than that. Odysseus's fleet spent a year on Aeaea, a full year, 4 seasons. The men ate well and drank well, and were looked after with a generosity that seems, from this distance, almost like kindness earned, as though Circe was making good, in some private way, for what she had done at the beginning. They recovered, they rested, they became, if not exactly the men they had been before Troy, at least something that was closer to functional. At the end of the year, it was his men who reminded Odysseus that there was somewhere else to be. They came to him after a feast one evening and told him gently but plainly that it was time. That home was still out there, that they needed to start moving again. And Odysseus, who had not forgotten, who was constitutionally incapable of forgetting, even during the quietest and most comfortable of intervals, went to Circe that night and asked her how to get back to Ithaca. She told him. The route home did not go where he expected. It did not proceed along any coastline he could chart or any current he could anticipate. Before Odysseus could return to the land of the living, Circe told him, he had to descend to the land of the dead. He had to go to the underworld. He had to find the shade of Tiresias, the great blind prophet of Thebes, dead now for generations, and hear from him the shape of what was still to come. Without that knowledge, she told him plainly, he would not make it home. He had no map for what lay ahead. Tiresias was the map. Odysseus received this information in the way he received most terrible news, with a silence that did not disintegrate into despair, and then with a question about what, precisely, he needed to bring with him. The crossing to the underworld is made by sail, a dark sea, a sunless ocean beyond the edges of the known world. The men sail in silence, in the way that people sail when they understand that the water they are crossing is different in kind from any water they have crossed before. They reach the far shore. They perform the rites Circe has described. A pit dug in the earth, libations of milk and honey and wine and water, the blood of slaughtered black sheep poured in, drawing up the shades who crowd and press at the edge of life to drink. The dead, in Homer's underworld, are shadows of their former selves, not the souls of Christian tradition, charged with the full weight of lived experience, more like impressions left behind, capable of memory and feeling, but drained of the particular vitality that makes a person fully present. They can only speak after they have drunk the blood, which gives them enough substance briefly to hold a conversation. The first shade to reach the pit is a young man named Elpenor, one of Odysseus's own crew, who had died on Aeaea the morning they left, having fallen from Circe's roof while drunk. He had not been buried. His body still lay on the island, and he begs Odysseus to go back and give him proper rites. There is something deeply melancholy about this. The unburied dead of the journey, those who fell without ceremony, turning up at the edges of the underworld to ask only for what every person deserves at the end. Odysseus promises. He will keep that promise. Then his mother appears, Anticlea. She had been alive when he left for Troy, and now she is here, among the shades, and he has to hold himself back from the pit and refuse to let her drink until Tiresias has had his portion, because the rules of this place are rigid, and he cannot afford to break them. That, holding himself back from his own dead mother, is perhaps the most disciplined thing Odysseus does in the entire poem. And it costs him. You can feel it costing him, even across 3,000 years of translation. Tiresias comes, drinks, speaks. He tells Odysseus what lies ahead. He tells him about the cattle of the sun god Helios, untouchable, sacred, grazing on an island called Thrinacia. He tells him that if any man harms those cattle, the fleet will be destroyed, and the survivors will arrive home alone and late and in misery. He tells him about the situation in Ithaca, the suitors, the disorder, the home that has come unwound in his absence, and he tells him that there will be more difficult things to do even after he arrives. The picture Tiresias paints is not optimistic, but it is honest. And Odysseus, characteristically, would rather have the honest picture. He steps back from the pit and allows his mother to drink. She tells him how she died. Not violently, not dramatically. She missed him. She missed him so completely and for so long that she simply faded. The grief of his absence, she tells him, was what finally let her go. And Odysseus tries to hold her. 3 times he reaches for her, and 3 times his arms close on empty air. Because the dead are what they are, and embraces are for the living. He asks why he cannot hold her. She explains gently that this is simply what death is. The sinews no longer hold the flesh to the bone. What he is reaching for is no longer there to be reached for. She tells him to remember what he has seen here, to carry it back to his wife when he returns, and she encourages him in a way that only a mother's shade encourages. Warmly, specifically, without false comfort. He weeps. The poem tells us this plainly. More shades come to the pit. The great heroes of the Trojan War, drawn by the smell of blood out of their gloomy rest. Agamemnon comes, the great king of Mycenae, who led the Greek forces at Troy, and who returned home only to be murdered by his wife and her lover in the bath. He tells Odysseus his story with a bitterness that has not mellowed in death, and he warns him about women, all women by implication, in the way of a man who has been burned so badly that he can no longer distinguish between the fire and the hearth. Odysseus listens but quietly notes to himself that Penelope is not Clytemnestra. He holds his wife separate in his mind from the generalization. He is right to do so. Achilles comes. Great, brief, burning Achilles. The man who chose a short, glorious life over a long, quiet one, who died at Troy as he had always known he would. Odysseus tells him what is due, that he is honored above all the dead, that his name will never be forgotten. Achilles says something remarkable. He says he would rather be a living slave, the lowest of the low, bound to the worst master the earth offers, than a king among all the dead. All that glory, all that chosen magnificence, and what he wants on the other side of it is simply to be alive, to be ordinary and alive. It is the most subversive thing in the poem, the entire heroic tradition, the entire framework that drove men to Troy in the first place, quietly undermined by the man who embodied it most completely. Then the crowd of dead grows too thick, too pressing, too loud. Odysseus fears that Persephone herself, queen of the dead, might send up something from the deeper dark that he is not equipped to face. He turns back to his ship and orders the men to row. They leave the land of the dead behind. They cross back to the sunlit world with oars, and without a word spoken between them, because there is nothing yet that any of them know how to say. They return to Aia. They buried Elpenor on the headland above the sea, raised a mound over him, and planted his oar on top of it. And that was what Odysseus gave his dead man. A grave, a marker, the oar he had rowed in life. The poem lingers on this briefly, not sentimentally, but with the quiet insistence that these things matter, that the rites owed to the dead are not formalities, but obligations, and that a leader who forgets his dead has lost something important about himself. Circe came to them at dawn. She brought food and wine and sat with Odysseus as the sun rose and told him what lay ahead with a frankness and a detail that no other figure in the poem provides. She told him about the sirens, about Scylla and Charybdis, about the cattle of the sun. She held nothing back, offered no false comfort, and asked nothing in return. This is Circe's final gift, not transformation, not a year of rest and feasting, but truth, carefully and completely told by a woman who has come to know Odysseus well enough to understand that he needs truth. the way other men need armor. He listened to everything. He memorized it. He went back to his men and told them it was time to sail. The sun rose fully over a year as they pushed off from the shore. Circe stood on the headland and watched them go. The poem does not tell us what she felt, watching that single ship grow smaller on the morning water. But it is easy enough to imagine. Part 3. The long way home. There is a particular quality to the final stretch of a long journey. It is not simply relief, though relief is certainly part of it. It is something more complicated, a kind of heightened awareness that sets in when you are close enough to the end to be afraid of losing it. Every remaining obstacle feels more threatening than the ones that came before, not because it is objectively worse, but because the cost of failure has grown. The further you have come, the more you stand to lose. Odysseus knows this. By the time he rows away from Aea, with Circe's instructions memorized and the morning light ahead of him, he is a man who has lost everything except his ship and his crew. He has spent 10 years fighting a war that wasn't his. He has watched his men die at Ismarus and be devoured on the Cyclops' floor and smashed into the harbor of the Laestrygonians. He has been delayed, detoured, enchanted, and driven backward by every force the physical and divine worlds could bring to bear against him. All of that, and still he has not made it home. What he has left now is Circe's map and his own irreducible will. It will have to be enough. The sirens were first. Circe had told him exactly what to do, and Odysseus, who had by now learned at considerable cost the difference between instructions worth following and ones worth questioning, followed hers precisely. He told his crew that they would be sailing past creatures whose voices were fatal to hear, and he gave each man beeswax to press into his ears so that no sound from the shore could reach them. They were to row past without looking up. They were to keep their stroke. They were to treat those shores as though they did not exist. He himself was not willing to miss it. This is entirely in character. Odysseus is constitutionally incapable of not knowing things. The sirens possess knowledge. That is their lure, or part of it. They know everything that has happened under the sun, and they sing of it. And a man who would sail willingly into a Cyclops' cave to see what lived there is not a man who will plug his own ears and pass knowledge by. He had his men lash him to the mast instead. He told them that no matter what he said, no matter how clearly he ordered or begged them to release him, they were to tighten the ropes and row harder. The ship came level with the siren shore. The poem does not tell us exactly what he heard. It tells us he was desperate to be freed from the mast. It tells us he strained against the ropes and signaled with his eyebrows for the men to untie him. His crew, ears sealed with wax, saw the signals and ignored them, rowing harder as instructed, tightening the ropes as the ship passed and the singing grew and then gradually fell behind. They cleared the siren shore intact, every man aboard, and Odysseus, lashed to his mast, heard something that no living man had ever heard and survived to carry away. Something the poem wisely refuses to describe in full, understanding that the imagination will always furnish something more powerful than any words could manage. Scylla and Charybdis waited just beyond. Circe had described them both, and her description was not comforting. Charybdis was a whirlpool, a vast, terrible suction in the water that 3 times a day pulled the sea down to its black bed, and 3 times a day hurled it back up again in a chaos of foam and roaring. If a ship was caught in it during the downswing, nothing would survive. The ship would simply cease to exist, swallowed into a darkness that had no bottom. Scylla, on the opposite cliff, was a monster. 12 dangling feet, 6 long necks, 6 heads, each head filled with 3 rows of teeth. She ate what she could reach, and what she could reach from her cliff top was the upper deck of any ship that passed too close. Circe had told Odysseus something about this passage that was, in its way, harder to accept than any of the physical dangers. She had told him to steer close to Scylla's cliff, to sacrifice 6 men, the 6 that Scylla's heads would inevitably take in order to save the rest. She had told him flatly that stopping to fight Scylla was not an option because fighting would only slow the ship and give her more time to feed. He had not told his men this. He had told them about Charybdis. He had not told them about Scylla. We can sit with that for a moment. The man who values knowledge above almost everything else, who cannot resist hearing what the sirens know, who announces his name to the Cyclops because he cannot bear to go unrecognized. That man chose here to withhold. Because some truths, given in advance, do not produce courage. They produce despair. The ship drove through the passage. He watched Scylla. He gripped 2 spears, and 6 of his men, the 6 she took, so quickly that they had no time to cry out until they were already above the ship, looking down with their hands reaching, were gone. The poem gives us their names. It does not let them be anonymous, and it gives us Odysseus watching from the deck, unable to help, calling this the most terrible thing he ever saw in all his years upon the sea. The man who kept knowledge from them to protect them watches them die and carries the knowing of it forever. That is not a small thing. Homer does not let it be a small thing. They reached the island of Thrinacia as the sun was going down, and Odysseus remembered everything Tiresias had told him, and everything Circe had told him, and he stood before his men and said simply, "We must not land here." Eurylochus spoke against him. The men were exhausted. They needed to sleep on solid ground. They were not going to touch any cattle or sacred animals. They were going to rest and sail on in the morning. Odysseus yielded. Against his better instincts, against every warning he had been given, he yielded to his men's exhaustion and his own, perhaps, and they made camp on the beach. Then the south wind failed. Then the east wind failed. Then the east wind failed. Then every wind failed entirely, and for a month the fleet sat in the harbor of Thrinacia going nowhere, eating through their provisions, watching the sun god's cattle graze in the green meadows above the beach with a proximity that became, over weeks of empty stomachs, increasingly difficult to bear. When the food was gone, Eurylochus spoke again. He made the argument that the hungry always make, that a man who dies at sea dies forgotten, while a man who eats and survives can build a temple to Helios and make it right. The men agreed. While Odysseus slept, they slaughtered the finest cattle and roasted them on the beach. He woke to the smell of it. The gods saw. Helios, the sun god, whose cattle these were, brought his grievance directly to Zeus. He threatened to take his light into the underworld if satisfaction was not given. Zeus promised that satisfaction would be given. They sailed when the winds returned. They were not yet a day out from the island, when Zeus sent a storm that split the ship open and threw every man into the sea. A lightning bolt, the poem says. Quick, specific, and final. The men died in the water around their broken ship, their bodies carried away by the waves like seabirds. Every man except Odysseus, who lashed together the mast and the keel with his own hands and floated on them through the storm until the sea quieted. And then the current pulled him, slowly and unavoidably, back toward the passage of Scylla and Charybdis. He came to Charybdis as it pulled the sea down. He grabbed the branch of a great fig tree growing from the cliff above, and hung there, above the spinning black hole of the whirlpool, while the timbers of his ship were sucked down and disappeared. He hung there until the whirlpool turned, as it always eventually turns, and hurled the wreckage back up. He dropped onto the floating mast and keel and paddled away. He was, for the first time since Troy, completely alone. 9 days he drifted. On the 10th day, the sea brought him to an island called Ogygia. On that island lived Calypso. Calypso was a goddess, daughter of Atlas, a figure of considerable divine power, and, It appears genuine warmth. She found Odysseus on her beach, half dead from the sea, and she chose not simply to heal him but to love him. She fed him, sheltered him, shared her island and her bed with him. She offered him something that no mortal, before or after, was ever offered by a divine being: immortality. Stay with her, she told him. Give up Ithaca. Give up the journey home. She would make him deathless and ageless forever. He refused. Every single day, for 7 years, he refused. He spent his days, the poem tells us, sitting on the rocks above the sea and looking west, weeping, eating what Calypso gave him, sleeping where she made a place for him, but never for a single day. Forgetting what lay in that direction, he kept staring, never releasing the idea of home, even when home had become something more like a concept than a physical place he could clearly remember. 7 years. Let that settle quietly for a moment. He had spent 10 years fighting the war. He would spend 10 years getting home. 7 of those years, he sat on an island with a goddess who loved him and could give him everything. And he wept for a rocky, wind-swept little island in the Ionian Sea, and a mortal woman growing older in a house full of strangers. That is, in its way, the most purely human thing in the entire poem. Not the monsters, not the gods. This, the particular acre belonging to a place and a person so completely that no gift, however extraordinary, can replace them. It was Athena who finally moved. She had always been Odysseus's patron, always privately regarded him with the particular affection that gods sometimes develop for mortals who think well. She went to Zeus and made the case for him plainly. The man had been punished long enough. His men were dead. Poseidon's grievance had been satisfied 100 times over. It was time. Zeus agreed. He sent Hermes to Ogygia to inform Calypso that Odysseus was to be released. Calypso received the message with the composure of someone who was not remotely surprised and was entirely unhappy. She made her feelings known to Hermes with a frankness that bordered on indignation, noting, with some justice, that the male gods pursued mortal women freely and without censure, while goddesses who did the same were ordered to give up the relationship on demand. It was not a complaint without merit. Hermes, characteristically, did not engage with the substance of the argument and simply restated the instruction. She told Odysseus that he was free to go. She gave him tools, timber, provisions. And here we see something important, because Odysseus, upon being told he can leave, asks her to swear by the Styx that this is not a trick. He trusts no one entirely, not even a goddess who has kept him safe for 7 years. That suspicion, that careful verification of everyone's intentions at every turn, is part of what has kept him alive this long. He built a raft. 4 days of work. On the 5th day, Calypso gave him clothes and provisions and a gentle following wind, and she stood on the beach and watched him sail away. The poem, again, does not tell us what she felt. The poem rarely tells us what women feel when they are left. It shows us their faces, and then it follows the ship. 17 days of sailing. On the 18th, the mountains of Scheria appeared on the horizon, and on that same day, Poseidon, returning from a feast among the Ethiopians, looked down and saw Odysseus crossing the open sea on a raft, nearly home. The god of the sea raised his trident and stirred the water. The storm that struck was of a different order from anything that had come before. A raft is not a ship. It has no hull, no hold, no shelter. Odysseus was thrown into the sea repeatedly, clinging to his timber, swallowing water, fighting the swells with the bare will to keep his face above them. A sea goddess named Leucothea, taking pity, rose from the water and gave him her veil, told him to wrap it around himself, abandon the raft, and swim. She told him the veil would keep him safe, and when he reached land, to throw it back into the sea without looking. He swam for 2 days. He came to the coast of Scheria bloody-handed from the rocks, and found a river mouth that opened onto a gentler shore, and dragged himself up the bank and lay down in a pile of leaves and slept. The Phaeacians were the people of Scheria. They were a seafaring folk, divinely favored, living at the edge of the world in a kind of refined peace that bore almost no resemblance to anything Odysseus had encountered since leaving Ithaca. Their ships sailed without rudders, knowing the minds of their crews. Their king, Alcinous, presided over a court of extraordinary hospitality. It was his daughter, Nausicaa, who found Odysseus in the morning. She had come to the river mouth with her handmaidens to do the household washing, brought there by a dream sent by Athena. Though the poem presents this as coincidence in the way that divinely arranged coincidences always appear coincidental to those experiencing them, her handmaids fled when the stranger emerged from the leaves, salt-crusted and terrible-looking. Nausicaa held her ground. She gave him clothes. She gave him oil to wash with. She told him how to approach the palace and who to appeal to. She was, from the first moment, composed and generous and entirely unrattled by the sudden appearance of a shipwrecked stranger, which says a great deal about both her character and her upbringing. King Alcinous received him with the full generosity of the Phaeacian tradition. There was a feast. There were athletic games the next day, at which one of the young Phaeacian men made the mistake of goading Odysseus about whether he was capable of athletic competition, and Odysseus picked up a discus and threw it considerably further than anyone else had managed, without particularly warming up first, which settled that. And then, at the feast that evening, a blind singer named Demodocus began to sing of the Trojan War. He sang of the famous quarrel between Odysseus and Achilles. He sang of the wooden horse. Odysseus pulled his cloak over his face and wept. Alcinous, a perceptive man, noticed. He stopped the entertainment and asked his guest, gently, who he was. And Odysseus, who had traveled so far under so many pseudonyms and disguises and careful evasions, finally said his name aloud in a friendly hall. He talked through the night. He told them everything. The Cyclops, Circe, the underworld, the cattle of the sun, all of it, in the voice of a man who has been holding a story for a very long time and is finally in the presence of people worth telling it to. The Phaeacians listened without interruption, caught completely, and when he was finished, Alcinous gave him treasure and a ship, and in the dark of that same night, the Phaeacian crew sailed him home. He slept the whole way, a deep, dreamless sleep, closer to death than rest. When he woke, he was lying on the shore of Ithaca, and he did not recognize it. Athena had veiled it in mist, partly to keep him safe from premature discovery, and partly, one suspects, because a man who has spent 20 years away from home and arrives to find it exactly as he left it might not quite believe it is real. She lifted the mist. The bay resolved, the familiar olive tree, the familiar cave, the particular quality of the light over these particular hills. He was home. He bent down and kissed the ground. He could not walk into his own hall, not yet. The situation at home, Athena briefed him, was this. The palace was full of suitors. Over 100 men from the surrounding islands, all of whom had decided that Penelope's husband was dead, and her hand was therefore available. They had been living in his house for years, eating his livestock, drinking his wine, pressuring Penelope daily to choose one of them, and let the matter be settled. His son Telemachus had grown up in a house full of men who treated him with contemptuous tolerance at best. Athena disguised him as an old beggar. She aged him, withered him, dressed him in rags, and sent him first to the hut of his faithful swineherd Eumaeus, who had kept the pig herds loyally for 20 years and was, in every way that mattered, a good man who deserved better than the situation he was living through. Odysseus spent his first night home in his own swineherd's hut, listening, learning the shape of the problem, keeping his name behind his teeth. Telemachus arrived the next morning, having been sent home from Sparta by Athena's prompting. He was 20 years old and had never known his father. He had grown up in the shadow of a legend. son of the great Odysseus, which was simultaneously an inheritance and an impossible weight. He had Odysseus's intelligence without yet having had the opportunity to develop Odysseus's ruthlessness. Odysseus revealed himself to his son in a moment that is among the most quietly overwhelming in the poem. He touched him. He wept. Telemachus wept. The father and son, who had been separated for the entirety of Telemachus's conscious memory, held on to each other in a swineherd's hut at the edge of a farm, and the poem gives this moment its full weight without decorating it. Then they made a plan. Odysseus entered his own hall as a beggar. What he saw there was everything he had been told, made viscerally real. The suitors were loud, entitled, reckless in the way of men who have been given no meaningful opposition for years. They mocked the old beggar who had appeared at the door. They threw a footstool at him. They challenged another beggar to fight him, which Odysseus won with studied understatement, using just enough force to make his point without revealing what he was actually capable of. Penelope appeared. He saw her. He could not speak to her, not directly, not yet. He watched her handle the suitors with the dignity of a woman who has been doing this careful, exhausting daily management of men who will not leave and will not stop for years. She came down to the hall with her handmaidens and spoke to the suitors with a poise that cost her enormously. The poem makes clear, and which she had learned to wear the way you learn to wear a wound. She had delayed the suitors by weaving. She had promised that when Laertes' burial shroud was complete, she would choose. For 3 years she wove by day and unraveled at night, until a treacherous handmaid exposed the ruse. The suitors discovered it. The delay ended. The pressure redoubled. Odysseus managed to speak with her, in his disguise, and told her things about her husband. Things only Odysseus could have known. Details of clothing, of appearance, that proved he had met the man. He told her he believed Odysseus was close to home. He watched her absorb this. He watched her decide, privately, not to let herself hope too much. She had been hoping for 20 years and was running out of hope to spend. She announced the contest, Odysseus's great bow, the one he had left behind when he sailed for Troy, because a weapon like that was not a weapon you brought to a 10-year siege. Whoever could string it and shoot an arrow cleanly through the line of 12 axe heads set in the floor, that man would be her husband. Not one suitor could string it. They warmed the wood, they oiled their hands, they passed it from man to man around that hall, and not one of them could draw it to the nock. The bow sat like a quiet verdict on everything they thought themselves to be. The old beggar asked if he might try. The uproar this caused was exactly what you would expect from a hall full of men who sensed, perhaps without quite knowing why, that something was about to change irrevocably. Telemachus, steady, having grown several years in the last 24 hours, told the suitors, with a precision borrowed from his father, that the bow would be given to whoever he chose to give it to. Eumaeus brought the bow to the old man's hands. Odysseus turned it over. He examined it the way a man examines something he made part of himself long ago, for warping, for damage, for the particular integrity of wood and sinew that tells an expert hand whether the thing is still what it was. It was. He strung it without visible effort. The hall went absolutely silent. He plucked the string. It sang like a swallow. Then he picked up an arrow and shot it through all 12 axes without rising from his stool. He looked at Telemachus. Telemachus took his place beside him with sword and spear. What followed was not glorious in the way that epic battles are glorious. It was close and terrible and fast. Odysseus and Telemachus and 2 loyal servants against more than 100 men in a closed hall with the doors barred. But the suitors had no armor and no weapons ready to hand, and Odysseus had the bow. He shot them as they ran and cowered and scrambled for the weapons that had been locked away. When the arrows ran out, they fought with spears, and the fighting was neither clean nor beautiful. It was simply what had to happen. When it was done, the hall was washed. The faithless servants who had helped the suitors were dealt with. The handmaid, Euryclea, his old nurse, who had recognized him days earlier by the scar on his leg and been sworn to silence, was sent upstairs to bring Penelope down. Penelope came to the hall and sat across from her husband, and she did not believe it was him. This is perhaps the most psychologically honest thing in the entire poem. 20 years. 20 years of false hope, of waiting, of men telling her to give up, of managing the house alone and the suitors daily, and the grief of not knowing. She had built a kind of fortress around herself, and it did not simply open because a man appeared who claimed to be her husband. She tested him. She told Euryclea, within his hearing, to bring out the bed from the bedchamber and make it up for the stranger. Odysseus's reaction was immediate and genuine. He told her that was impossible, because the bed could not be moved. He had built it himself years ago, carving the frame from a living olive tree that grew up through the floor of the room, cutting and shaping it in place, building the chamber around it. That bed was rooted in the earth of Ithaca itself. No one could move it. Anyone who said it had been moved was either lying or had soared through the living wood and destroyed the thing that made it what it was. Only one person in the world knew this. Penelope's fortress opened. She crossed the room. She held him. She wept in the way that the poem describes as the feeling of a swimmer who has been at sea for days and finally touches solid ground, which is, given what he has just been through, an image that carries a particular and deliberate weight. They talked through the night. He told her everything. She told him everything. The olive tree stood where it had always stood, rooted in the floor of their house, holding the bed that was both a marriage and a home in a single piece of still living wood. The morning came, as mornings do. Regardless of what the night has held, there would still be the families of the dead suitors to contend with, grief curdling, as it sometimes does, into a desire for retribution. There would be Laertes, his aged father, living in a farmhouse outside the city, not yet knowing his son was home. There would be, the poem hints in its final pages, more to do before any of this was truly settled. But the poem ends, or nearly ends, with Odysseus and Penelope in their bed, with the house quiet around them, with the olive tree holding up the frame, with a particular silence of a place that has been waiting a long time for something to return, and is now, at last, no longer waiting. Athena holds back the dawn to give them more time. The goddess of wisdom and craft reaches into the mechanisms of the world and slows the sun's passage, because some mornings should be allowed to take longer than they would otherwise. The Odyssey has been with us for nearly 3,000 years. It has been translated into almost every major language on Earth. It has been reimagined, reinterpreted, set in space and in wartime, and in the everyday lives of people navigating ordinary grief. It has been studied in universities and read aloud in kitchens. It has been the subject of more scholarship, more argument, more passionate disagreement than almost any other text in human history. And none of that accumulated attention has made it feel any older or any less alive. Because it is not, at its core, a story about ancient Greece. It is not really about gods or monsters or the geography of the Aegean Bronze Age. It is about what it means to keep moving when every force available to the universe seems committed to stopping you. It is about the relationship between knowing something and being able to hold on to it in the dark. It is about what home actually is. Not a place exactly, but a particular combination of a place and the people in it, and the version of yourself you are when you are with those people. Odysseus is not the greatest Greek hero. He is not the strongest, or the most noble, or the most straightforwardly virtuous. He lies. He makes catastrophic mistakes. He gives in to his own pride at exactly the wrong moment, and pays for it in years. He is a man of jagged edges and comprehensive cunning, and an absolute, unshakable refusal to give up, which is perhaps exactly why, of all the heroes of the ancient world, it is his name we are still speaking.